All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and author of Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org or scotthortonshow.com. I've got more than 6,000 interviews in the archive for you there going back to 2003. And follow me on all the video sites and X at Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, on the line, I've got our friend Ted Snider. He writes for us at antiwar.com and at the Institute. And it's time we catch up on the Ukraine war. Welcome back to the show, Ted. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good, Scott. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Very happy to have you here. And got a couple of important articles here to talk about. And really, this one is about another important article, a New York Times blockbuster, you call it. That was recently published. In fact, I should have already had the tab open and the title for you. Oh, one more step. I just have to click this CAPTCHA. It's Adam Entous in the New York Times. Is that how you say it? Entous?
I don't know.
Entous?
Yeah, Adam Entos. I'm not sure how to say his name.
The Secret History of America's Involvement in the Ukraine War. So, as you say in your article, they already had articles like this in the New York Times. As I read it, the first thing that I thought was, hey, I already knew all this from the New York Times itself and from other places and have this all in my book already, almost all of it. I mean, they have sort of anecdotes about some officers were in town and, went from here to there, gave somebody a ride here to there, this and that kind of thing. But almost all of this is in Provoked already, as far as the depth of America's involvement in the war, and even the parts about how everything that's gone wrong is all their fault, and all of that is in there too. So, and you say the same in your article, that we already knew most of this. So the question is, what's new?
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's read your book, anybody who's followed the news, they already knew that the U.S. was not only the U.S. and the West were not only providing Ukraine with the weapons, but also with the training on the weapons and the targeting for the weapons and the war gaming and planning and intelligence that, they were providing everything except the bodies that pushed the button and the bodies that got killed. That's not news. I mean, the article does provide, some important details and some important names, but that's not new. But I think the article was important for the stuff that was important that he didn't mean to say was important. It was the stuff that was the nuggets that were kind of hidden into it. And Scott, I think one of the main things was the timing of it, because as you already alluded to, what really struck me about this article was that it was really written as, I think, the first sort of major piece in the mainstream media to prepare the American public for a defeat in Ukraine. It really flips the script, which I want to talk about more after, but it really kind of reads to me like a preparation for, don't blame us, we really did everything we could. We have to negotiate now, and it's the Ukrainians' fault. Um, but before we get to that, there were other things in it that, again, were maybe not entirely not known if you followed the media closely, but a lot of people don't. And what was striking about it to me was how clearly this article admits that the US really frequently approached Russian red lines that, despite what they were telling us, the Americans genuinely feared could lead to World War III or a nuclear war. And we get told stories about the CIA being authorized for what they say, what Entus calls the CIA was authorized officers in Kharkiv to assist Ukrainians with operations inside the box. And inside the box is code for inside Russia. And it means, as the Times article says, that the United States was now woven into the killing of Russian soldiers on sovereign Russian soil. So this is Americans helping attacks in Russia. They know that the Russian nuclear doctrine says that Russia could hypothetically use nuclear weapons if the very existence of the state is threatened. And they were threatening the very existence of the state. And they had this operation that they codenamed Lunar Hail,
And I'm not sure if he misstates that or not, or he kind of left out, but the Russians had even announced their new doctrine was a threat to the territorial integrity of the state. So not even its existence, but just any significant part of it.
Yeah,
So
and when you rightly add that, Scott, it's important to include that the Russians consider Crimea to be part of that territorial integrity.
absolutely.
And with Operation Lunar Hail, the Biden administration had authorized Ukraine um, to strike inside Crimea with long-range missiles. And they weren't just authorizing Ukraine to strike inside Crimea with long-range missiles. Those long-range missiles were US supplied. Those long-range missiles required US satellite data to target them. They
Mm.
couldn't be used without US
And were these
assistance.
the same strikes that killed the people on the beach? I think the way I remember it was, yeah. And then once they finally got permission to hit Crimea, the first thing they did was kill a bunch of civilians and then say, well, it's their fault for trying to vacation in the middle of a war.
Yeah, I remember that story too, and I can't remember the particular event. And there were, I mean, there were rounds of escalating long-range missiles where the range got longer and longer and longer. Um, and so what you have is that you've got the U.S. assisting with targeting in Crimea and eventually deep inside Russia itself, knowing full well, and they'd heard Russian officials and Russian generals talking about, how crossing these distances, these longer and longer and longer distances that missiles could fly, crossing Russian red lines, and there's just this astonishing part in the Times article when they say that they were genuinely concerned about World War III and even nuclear war, and there's this moment in the Times article when they talk about the longer range missiles being introduced and Russian generals talking about weapons that fire that far could trigger the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And remember, Scott, like there was a lot of talk about Putin threatening nuclear war and all this stuff, but the media kept telling us that the Biden administration was calculating this carefully. They were escalating in measured ways that wouldn't lead to nuclear war, that they were determined not to lead to World War III or nuclear war. And then the article tells us that when they introduced the next round of long-range weapons, that they estimated they would raise, and this is a quote from the article, Scott, quote, the chance of Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine to 50%. So there was a 50-50 chance that their decision to authorize this Operation Lunar Hail, striking in Crimea, a 50-50 chance that authorizing that would lead to nuclear war, and they authorized it anyway. So in hindsight, that's terrifying, right? They, they,
At
they
the
they
same
knew
time,
there
they're
was a
telling us,
50-50 chance of nuclear war, and they authorized it.
and they're telling us that the only reason this is happening is because Putin has gone psychopath. And this is
Yeah.
the most unstable, ruthless dictator in the world.
So
And
Scott, I mean,
at the same
I
time, they're
would
clearly
argue.
betting on the fact that he doesn't drink at all and he doesn't get emotional at all. Thank God he's such a cold, calculating sociopath and not the kind of guy who gets really upset. Because what if he did?
Yeah, what if he did? Because we're told it's Putin threatening the nuclear stuff, and here's the states taking actions that they know is a 50-50 chance of leading to nuclear war. And
And Ted,
remember,
did I read this right? And do you know if this is true? Two-parter there, that they say that once a Russian, do I even have this right? It says in the article somewhere, right, that some Russian general who started talking about using nukes got fired.
I don't remember if he got fired. The general you're talking about is Surovkin, I think, and he said that they said that they overheard him talking about using tactical nuclear weapons if the Ukrainians made a beeline for Crimea. I don't even know if that's true, but that's what the Americans said. They heard him talking about that.
Hmm.
So
But
they
there was
heard.
nothing about how he got demoted or anything for that.
I
I
can't
thought
remember, and
that
I'm
was
trying to
what
remember if he did get demoted or not.
yeah, I'm sorry
I can't.
to interrupt you
Yeah,
with
no,
my
I just
half
can't
baked
remember that. But
thing.
but
Go
Scott,
ahead.
what really strikes me is what your earlier comment about who was being cautious and who was being risky, because when the Americans are doing these actions that they know could lead to nuclear war, they also know the Russians know that, right?
Yeah.
The Russians know that the Americans are providing the targeting information for the long-range missiles. Putin said that on the public media. He said, we know these missiles can't be fired without US satellites directing them. So it's really the Americans that are being cavalier. And Putin, thank goodness, is actually the one that's being unbelievably cautious, right? It's Putin's restraint, not the Americans. It's Putin's restraint that prevented this war from escalating to what we now know in hindsight were terrifying odds that it could escalate. So I thought that was an interesting part of the article that even though we knew that, and I think all of this is in your book, and we knew that, I'm not sure I've ever seen the mainstream media so clearly set out how close we came to provoking a wider war, possibly even a nuclear war. So that I thought was huge. That's not what the author meant to be huge. He meant to
Right.
do this great reveal of how woven the U.S. was into the killing machine. And that's interesting, Scott. But as others have pointed out, this is interesting information, but it's all information that was provided to the New York Times by military sources, American military sources, who knew this stuff was top secret, but they chose to reveal it to him anyway, right? So they chose to reveal very specific bits of top secret information because they wanted this to get out. And I think the thing that's most interesting, Scott, and it's getting out is that, and this is what I talk about in my article, is that this really reads like a flipping of the script to me. The script up to now had been the U.S. promised Zelensky that if he leaves the path of diplomacy, in Istanbul at the beginning of the war, that they will give him everything he needs for as long as he needs it. Then Zelensky can say, with his Ukraine victory plan that basically asks for everything I need for as long as I need it, that, I begged the states, they abandoned me, they didn't give us the weapons that we need, they've left us on our own, we have no choice now but to negotiate. In other words, what Zelensky was going to do, I think, is blame the Americans. We did everything right, they didn't do what they were supposed to do, so we have no choice to negotiate. And the New York Times article very cleverly flips the script and says that the US can say we did everything we were supposed to do, that the Ukrainians let us down, and now we have no choice to negotiate. It's a remarkable thing in this war that the Russians are clearly winning. According to the Times article, the American Ukrainian partnership, they openly call it, um, has triumph after triumph and victory after victory. And clearly, according to this article, we really could have beat the Russians, and we really would have beat the Russians had the Ukrainians not let us down so much. And they talk constantly about. There's this one quote that stood out to me, where it says the Americans sometimes couldn't understand why the Ukrainians didn't simply accept good advice. That we mapped it all out. They didn't take the advice. That every victory is presented as a Ukrainian victory. Every every victory is presented as an American victory. Every loss is presented as a Ukrainian loss. The Russians aren't even in the narrative, right? There's never a Russian victory because the Russians have a victory. Any Russian victory is just because the Ukrainians didn't listen to the States and made a mistake and Russia slipped in. Like there's no Russia in this story at all. And we're told time and again that missions failed simply because the Ukrainians either didn't listen to American plans and changed them, or they hesitated, or they wavered, or they wouldn't budge. The counteroffensive would have worked if it had started on time, except the Ukrainians wouldn't commit. We know that's not true. We know from other reporting that the Pentagon really didn't think the counteroffensive was going to succeed. But here we're told it was beautifully planned, it would have succeeded, but the Ukrainians just blew it and wouldn't succeed. So it's a fascinating article to me, not because, as you said, it revealed anything that you haven't already revealed and others haven't already revealed. It's interesting to me for the timing and for what top secret things were told to the Times and the way the Times frames it and flips the media. And I really think this is a psychological operation to prepare the public to not complain about the billions of dollars spent and the thousands of lives lost. It was worth it. We did the right thing. We did it well. It's not our fault. The Ukrainians let us down. So now the best thing to do is negotiate. We have to. And that's what really struck me about the article.
Now, so what do you think is the purpose of them putting in so many points about just how dangerous it was and how far they pushed us towards war, killing Russians inside the box in Kursk. The CIA helping lead that on the ground, they said, I think, there. And then, of course, contractors and special operations guys helping with the targeting and all that.
Yeah, it's a great
The
question, Scott.
50-50
And I
chance
may
of
be naive, but
nuclear
I
war.
honestly believe that the New York Times reporter reveals his most interesting journalism when he doesn't intend it to be the journalism, but to be the anecdotes or the evidence behind the journalism. That the really
Mhm.
interesting stuff that comes out is the stuff that he didn't mean to be the interesting stuff. I think that material is provided just to show how far America really went to help Ukraine so that no
Yeah.
one can say later, because this is the claim Ukraine will make, right? No one can say later, Ukraine lost the war because the states held back. They wouldn't give
Yeah.
us what they need. They wouldn't give us permission to fire, long distance. They wouldn't give us the missiles. And I think he's laying the case that we gave them everything.
Yeah,
We
we went
gave them
right up to
long-range
the
missiles.
edge
We
of
gave
nuclear war for you, even, but they don't,
exactly,
not
exactly.
recognizing that. We're going to be horrified when we read that, not pleased.
I think that's exactly right. I think it's like accidental. I think it's laying the defensive groundwork so that when Ukraine says you didn't do what you promised, we lost because you didn't give us, you held back on the arms, you wouldn't let us fire deep into Russia. This article saying we gave you everything. We not only let you fire into Russia, we helped you fire into Russia. We did everything. As you said, we even went to the brink of nuclear war for you. We have to negotiate now because you let us down. Ukraine let us down. That you hesitated, you didn't trust, you wavered, you blew it. Um, it's I think that the most interesting information comes out just in laying down the defense for the flipping of the script that America did everything, Ukraine didn't keep its end of the deal, and so now I have to negotiate. When the truth is whether whatever you believe should have happened or shouldn't have happened, the Americans did promise Zelensky that if he left negotiations and fought Russia to advance American foreign policy interests, that they would provide everything he needs for as long as he needs it, and they didn't. And this is, I think, the defense against that accusation. When Zelensky says, "I went to you, I told you what I needed, you wouldn't provide it. Now this little country's alone against Russia. We can't win. We're going to have to negotiate." This is an anticipatory defense against that claim, saying, "No, we gave you everything, right? You blew it because you let us down. You hesitated."
Yeah. Hey, y'all, let me tell you about Robertson Roberts Brokerage, Inc. Nobody trusts the U.S. dollar anymore. Foreign governments are stocking up on gold instead of $100 bills. One, they know they need to, and two, that means you need to too. Interest rates are up, but for some reason, not much for savings accounts. Park your money there and watch Uncle Joe Biden just counterfeit its value away. You can see how the Fed is afraid to raise rates to beat inflation for fear of popping the current bubbles, at least before the election. So more inflation it will continue to be. Gold is your shield against monetary and price inflation, just like it always has been. Now, Tim Fry and the guys over at Robertson Roberts are recommending gold over silver since the world's almost 200 governments are putting their own pressure on the price, which should help everyone else who makes similar calls on their own. Of course, Robertson Roberts can help you with platinum, palladium, and silver, as well as gold. Don't let the Fed and the war party inflate all your savings away. Look up Robertson Roberts at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. Hey, you guys, the audiobook of Provoked is out. Okay, well, I've started posting the chapters at my Substack, scotthortonshow.com, and my Patreon, patreon.com/scotthortonshow. You, of course, already bought and read the book and gave extras to your friends and reviewed it positively on amazon.com. But now you want to listen to me read the dang thing out loud, right? Subscribe today. scotthortonshow.com. Hey, y'all, libertasbella.com is where you get Scott Horton Show and Libertarian Institute shirts, sweatshirts, mugs, and stickers and things, including the great Top Lobsters designs as well. See, that way it says on your shirt why you're so smart. Libertas Bella, from the same great folks who bring you ammo.com for all your ammunition needs, too. That's libertasbella.com. Hey, y'all got kids or nephews or anything? You know about the Tuttle Twins books, right? Libertarian lessons about life, liberty, truth, and the state. It's really great stuff. And hey, did you guys know I'm a Tuttle Twin? Or, well, I'm a character in their world now. Skater Scott, local vert dog and anti government know it all. They introduced me in a short book last year, and I hear they're going to develop my character's story a bit more in the future. Cool, right? Anyway, they're now celebrating 10 years and having sold millions of these books. And now they're giving away a free magazine at TuttleTwins.com/10years. There's no shipping charge, and they're not going to ask for your credit card. It's just a free magazine. The gimmick is that inside the magazine, they've got a really great deal to get all the books. The best deal they've ever offered, which you will certainly want to take them up on. So go to TuttleTwins.com/10years for your free magazine, and someday, hopefully soon, you and your kids will be reading all about the libertarian antics of cartoon me, along with all my new pals. That's TuttleTwins.com/10years. All right, so that brings us to, where are we now here? So before I ask you all about your analysis of Trump's diplomacy here, let me ask you about the war itself. We know that the recent news is that the Russians retook all of Kursk, and but I don't know. I guess I had read that, I get a Google news alert for Andriy Beletsky, the leader of what's now called the Third Corps, which is, the Azov Battalion. Went from a battalion to a brigade to now it's the Third Corps, they call it. And they've been leading a fight even into Luhansk. And so, I don't know if they claim to have retaken a couple small villages here or there or whatever it is. So, how fluid is the front line? How much momentum? I guess there's the new DNI report, the Tulsi Gabbard threat assessment, that said that, I'm paraphrasing, time is on the Russian side and they're advancing. But are they advancing faster than before? Is the situation that dire? We've been told from anti-war people, military experts, that the Ukrainians are losing and they're on their last legs, and at some point their military is just going to break and fall apart. But that sure hasn't happened yet. It's been 3 years, and they do have a lot of money in Western support and weapons, as I think the Times article explains. They killed a lot of Russians with those HIMARS. They were able to target them very carefully and kill them in large numbers when they were foolish enough to group together in one big building or what have you. So where exactly is the state of the war? And then let's talk about the diplomacy.
Yeah. So just off the top, I'm not a military expert. What I'm reading and what I'm being told, um, the Kursk effort was a horrific failure. I wrote a piece with Alexander Hill on this for Anti-War, and Alexander Hill is a military expert. And one of the things that Kursk was meant to do was to acquire land for bargaining. It was a disaster. All it did is it took the best Ukrainian troops off the line in Ukraine. They not only didn't hold any land, but because of that, they lost more land. And so there's these, attempts to keep trying to break into Russia to acquire land. I think the mistake that the mainstream media makes all the time is measuring this in terms of territory. You know, despite the claims of, Russians' imperial ambitions, Putin says the goal of this war was never about territory. It was about, and this gets us to the next article actually, but the core interest that led to the war of, Ukraine and NATO and the protection of Russian ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So I don't think this can be measured by how fast is the front moving. This can be measured by how fast is Ukraine running out of Ukrainian soldiers and how fast is Ukraine running out of weapons. I think that the Russian advance has been much faster in 2025 than in 2024, but not super fast. And I think when you hear people saying that the front could collapse and stuff, and it hasn't, because as you said, Ukraine still does have a lot of weapons, a lot of money. They can go on for a while, but the Russians have clearly turned the tide in the war. They've definitely learned from their earlier mistakes. They've adapted. They're fighting a much more methodical, much smarter war. They're fighting a very successful war. I think now the land is slowly coming, but that's not the idea. The idea of these attacks is to keep Ukraine firing the missiles, keep Ukrainian soldiers coming in. They're wearing them down. And I think there is a risk that the Ukrainian front could collapse, and we don't know when that will be. But the longer the West keeps this war going, and Europe seems bent on keeping this war going, the greater the risk that the Ukrainian front will eventually collapse. They're not going to win the war. They're not going to gain much land back. All keeping this war going does is kill more Ukrainians. slowly cost Ukraine more land. When a ceasefire does happen, and it'll probably happen along the lines of the ceasefire, even though Putin sometimes talks about keeping more territory. He hasn't said that lately, but when it does come to it, it's going to come down to where the line is, and that line's advancing. So nobody's doing any favors by trying to get in the way of negotiations and keep supporting Ukraine in the war. They're not supporting Ukraine in the war. They're supporting their own goals. They're hurting Ukraine in the war. The Ukrainian front could collapse eventually, but whether it collapses or not, come ceasefire time, the longer we push back that ceasefire, the more Ukrainians are going to die, and the more Ukrainian land's going to have lost. And that's all the West is doing for Ukraine right now is costing them. They're not helping them.
Yeah. All right. Now, it looks to me like, and I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to read your piece on this yet, but I see it's out there. No quick end to the war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
also at antiwar.com. So I think Trump was sincere about wanting to negotiate, but the problem is, as you just described, America, i.e., Ukraine, the West, we're in a position of weakness here. He doesn't really have any cards to play. He's like threatening ultimate sanctions against any country that does business with Russia, this kind of thing. I don't know if he even means that. He'd change his mind after a day or two, if history's any guide there. And he can give weapons to the Ukrainians, but Biden already tried that, and the Russians are winning anyway. And I mean, it's the obvious question of whether, I mean, you're right. I'm sure you're right. I know Daniel Davis says that the Russians' goal here is just chewing up the Ukrainian army, not just taking territory. But it is going to come
Scott,
down to
if
when we
Russia
call.
wanted that territory, they could have taken it years ago when the Donbass, those places asked to be part of Russia, and Putin said no. Like they could have
Yeah.
taken that territory without going to war, right? This
Although
it's
at this point, I mean, they've got four provinces, of most, almost all of two,
parts
and
of them, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
and super majorities of the other two, I guess, or But then Odessa's right there, just a hop, skip, and a ollie from Crimea, and then that would complete the so-called land bridge to Transnistria, and it would ultimately screw the Ukrainians out of their ability to export wheat out of there. It's the jewel of the Black Sea, and it was originally a Russian city. So was Kharkiv, originally a Russian city. And so at this point, I don't know how to read Putin's mind or how ambitious he is at this point. You drove him this far. Now what? But plus, he has obviously Russian politics to take into account. And I do hear, from time to time from their side that, oh, we're taking Kharkiv, all right, and this kind of thing. You know what I mean? So I wonder,
There's
like, what you
a
think are the chances? If the question is, what are the chances that Putin goes ahead and makes a chump out of Trump and keeps fighting until he does break the Ukrainian army and take that territory? Because these people only understand one thing, force, et cetera, like
Scott,
they
I think
always
there's
say.
a long history going back to the conflict in Georgia and the conflict in the Donbass, where Russian hardliners have been really angry with Putin for not going as far as they wanted him to go. When Putin has used the military, it's always been very measured to achieve very certain goals. And I think it's the same this time. I think that Putin's using the military to attain very certain goals. And those goals, he's clearly stated them from the beginning, which is keeping Ukraine out of NATO, keeping NATO weapons out of Ukraine, protecting ethnic Russians in Ukraine. I think if you sat down to negotiate and you acknowledge those realities, that Putin's not going to give up at the negotiating table what he could win on the battlefield, right? If you acknowledge those realities that we need a security structure in Europe that doesn't include Russia being left out of it and the rest of the world moving closer and closer to their borders, you sit down with Putin and you give him no NATO in Ukraine and protection of ethnic Russians. I don't think he will screw Trump and go on and try to acquire more territory. But the longer we go not offering him that, the longer the Russian military will keep advancing and gaining more of that territory in order to force Ukraine and the West to give those concessions. So if you want to stop the loss of Odessa and more Ukrainian territory, the way to do that is to negotiate a peace. And the way to negotiate a peace is to face the reality. And the reality is, as I said, Putin's not going to give up at the negotiating table what he knows he can eventually win on the battlefield. And that is once and for all getting a written guarantee that NATO won't encroach upon its borders through Ukraine, and that ethnic Russians who remain in Ukrainian territory will receive language rights, political rights, right? So they have to face those realities and offer that in negotiations. I don't think Putin will say, I was joking all along, I'm going to go take your territory. I think the territory is just being taken as a way to force the West to address those, what Putin keeps calling the root causes of the war. It was interesting to me that Russia's um, foreign ministry said recently that we are serious about negotiations, but we can't accept them as they are because they haven't yet addressed the core demands of the root causes of the conflict. And that was and then it was also really interesting, Scott, and I talked about this in the article, that he seems to have received support for that from some of the powerful players in the multipolar world. Not that they support the invasion. I've never heard Russia, I've never heard China or India come out and say, we approve of the invasion. But what they have said is, interestingly, Xi Jinping is about to go to Moscow, and the Chinese foreign minister has said exactly like the Americans have said. I think the start of this, by the way, just to go back for 1 second. I know we're running out of time, but
Yeah,
the
real
thing that
quick.
started this article for me, the no quick end to the war in Ukraine, was Marco Rubio's statement recently that we're still far from a diplomatic solution. There's no guarantee that will be one. That these promises of a quick solution, although I think sincere, smashed up against the reality that there really are difficult core issues here to solve. And Russia's insistence that the war can't stop until the core issues have been addressed. And the Chinese foreign ministry, preparing for a visit with Putin, says that exactly the same thing as Rubio, that a diplomatic solution is far away. And then they say that's because the causes are complex and we advocate eradicating the causes. This is what Russia's been saying. And India, who paused visits to Russia during the war, has now invited Putin to India for the first time, again expressing some kind of diplomatic support for Putin's tactics in the negotiations. And when Russia accepted that invitation to India, it was interesting that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in thanking them, thanked them for supporting Russia in its having dialogue for the elimination of the root cause of the conflict. So you get Russia, China, and India all saying negotiations have to address the root causes of the conflict. And here's where I think that the dream of a quick negotiation sort of smashes up against the reality that there are real issues, and those real issues are NATO encroaching on Russia, and that we need a larger security structure for Europe, like should have happened in the Cold War. And when that happens, the war will stop. But Putin's not going to stop the war until he gets that,
All right.
because he's going to get that either at the battlefield or the negotiating table. He's determined to get that.
Yeah. All right. I'm sorry. We're all out of time. Thank you, Ted, for
Yeah.
yours.
Thanks so much, Scott.
All right, you guys, that's Ted Snider. He's at antiwar.com and at the Libertarian Institute. Thanks for listening to The Scott Horton Show, which can be heard on APS Radio News at scotthorton.org, scotthortonshow.com, and the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org.